Welcome, Roadmaster.
By 1983, Ford had now moved on to the third generation of their ever-popular Mustang with the now infamous Fox platform-based Fox-bodied Mustang. It was by that same year, though, that the Ford Thunderbird had now been through a whopping 9 generations of cars. Starting out as a direct competitor to the Corvette and morphing over the years into a series of big personal luxury coupes, the Thunderbird had become a staple for the Ford brand. But with the rise of European market personal luxury cars in the 80s, the Thunderbird had to be reimagined in order to compete with its German competition. It had to be equally well equipped, full of modern tech, be just as quick, and most of all, be affordable. But to make this a reality, Ford had their work cut out for them. And strangely enough, though, they managed to pull it off with this car, the 9th generation Ford Thunderbird Turbo Coupe. Now, before you head to the comments and angrily type in, "A Ford could never hold a candle to a Mercedes or BMW," please just hear me out. This new for 1983 9th Gen Thunderbird was not your granddad's 70s T-Bird that was only capable of woeful understeer and subpar 0 to 60 times. Ford was moving their entire production line to the new and more vertically integrated Fox chassis for a plethora of their cars. And a few years earlier, in 1980, they actually moved the Thunderbird onto the Fox chassis for the first time. The problem, though, was that the 1980 and 1981 Thunderbirds did not sell as well as their prior generation counterparts. And one look at the 8th Gen Thunderbirds could show you that these Ford the last bit of that mid-70s landmark era. But they didn't do it well. Actually, Ford's practice of design draft format didn't let have it gone well, which meant that Ford quickly went back to the drawing board to redesign the new Fox-based T-Birds in hopes to rebound sales numbers. This time, though, the design would become much more European in nature rather than classically American. Gone was that square slab front end, and in its place was a more rounded off and aerodynamic friendly design. The T-Bird actually had a really impressive drag coefficient of 0.35, which is about the same as a current generation Mazda Miata for reference. The whole 9th Gen car, when you compare it to the previous 8th Gen cars that were just a year or two older, it's a night and day difference, and that was exactly what Ford needed if they wanted to have any hope at competing with the Europeans and the Japanese. At launch, the 1983 Thunderbird was available with a 3.8-liter V6 with 110 horsepower on tap and the venerable Ford 5-liter V8 with a whopping 140 horsepower. These were pretty much the same old usual suspects in terms of Ford power plants. But halfway through the 1983 model year, Ford would throw us their biggest curveball yet. A third engine option appeared for the new Thunderbird, and that was the all-new 2.3-liter single overhead cam turbocharged inline-4 motor. This was a derivative of the motor found in the eventual Mustang SVO, and it was now technically the most powerful engine option available for the T-Bird, with 142 horsepower on tap with just an 8-to-1 compression ratio. Peak power was made at 5,400 RPM and peak torque was 172 foot-pounds, and that was achieved at 3,800 RPM. Fitted with an air research turbocharger and fuel injection, this 2.3-liter was running at a max boost level of 10 psi, with the best part being that you could row your own gears with the Turbo Thunderbird if you wanted to, courtesy of a Borg-Warner T5 manual transmission. Or you could go the automatic route if you so chose. And a limited slip differential was standard on all the turbo cars as well. The suspension setup on the Turbo T-Birds was a McPherson strut up front with a quad shock live axle in the rear, where a set of horizontally mounted shocks were fitted in conjunction with the vertical ones to help improve performance. With the lightweight 4-cylinder up front, the Turbo 4 cars were more tossable in turns than their V8 counterparts as well. Road and Track had this to say about the first Turbo Thunderbird that they could get their hands on in 1983. To say that this is the best Thunderbird in recent years is a dramatic understatement. The Turbo Coupe's handling and responsiveness are right up there with its best of class. Its drivability is exemplary. It's a very good car as it now rolls, and with only minor refinements, it could become a really great GT car value. And that's exactly what Ford did, because just a few short years after the introduction of the Turbo Coupe Thunderbirds, they flipped the script entirely and overhauled the turbo cars. Now, not much changed with the Turbo T-Birds from 1983 to 1986, with just a minor power bump to 155 horsepower and an interior dashboard redesign in 1985 that ended up carrying through the rest of the production run. But 1987 brought around this, the newly facelifted Turbo Coupes. The whole Thunderbird lineup at this point ditched the square 4 headlights in the front and moved to a smoother, even more aerodynamic front redesign, with the most extreme of them being the Turbo Coupe, which eliminated the center grille and replaced it with 2 large hood vents and a lower front bumper intake. The rear end was also smoothed out more to match the look. This was the beginning of the more rounded off era of Ford design, which we saw become very prevalent in the 90s. The 2.3-liter Turbo 4 was now outfitted with an intercooler, which meant that boosts could be turned up to nearly 15 psi now. That resulted in the new overall power output of 190 horsepower for the 5-speed equipped cars. And that wasn't the end of all the upgrades that the 1987 cars got. Anti-lock brakes were now standard at all 4 corners, and the suspension was now assisted with the help of some trick new electronics. Now with an electronic suspension control module and a mode selector to choose between a comfort focus setting or a handling focus setting for the suspension, which might as well have been a supercomputer on board in terms of 1980s domestic auto tech. This was a pretty big deal for the Thunderbird. All these improvements greatly improved the performance of the Turbo T-Birds as well. Early cars could do a 9.70 to 60 sprint and a 17.1 second quarter mile. The new cars could do an 8-second 0 to 60 sprint and a 16-second quarter mile, with a full second off the 0 to 60 time and a quarter mile, which was a massive improvement. Not to mention the overall higher top speed as well of 137 miles per hour. The performance difference between these new cars and the old ones was astounding, enough to where if I had just bought an 83 or 84 car, for example, I would be pissed as to how much better the new cars were. In fact, Motor Trend actually awarded the Turbo Coupe with the Motor Trend Car of the Year award in 1987. The Turbo Coupe was an excellent car for the period, especially at the tail end of its production run after 1987. But how did it stack up against the foreign competition? Well, at a base price of around $17,000 in 1987, let's take a look at some of the comparable vehicles. The E30 BMW 325S started at $27,500. In 1987, Toyota Supra Turbo started at $22,500, and the Mercedes 380 SEC was a whopping $49,000. Now, everyone knows that 1980s Mercedes cars were built like tanks, but at around 3 times the price of the Thunderbird, that was a difference that only the truly wealthy could afford to swallow. Now, the Turbo Supra was about 30% more expensive than the T-Bird, but it did also offer considerably better performance. And the 325IS BMW was lighter than the T-Bird, and it did handle a lot better in the turns, and it was more tossable. The main point where the T-Bird lacked compared to its competition was in the interior. The T-Bird featured a full instrument panel similar to that of a Lincoln Mark 7, including some cool touches for the time, like a nicely center-flowing console and bucket seats with adjustable thigh bolsters. Despite these advancements, the interior's quality wasn't universally seen as luxurious, with criticisms of its somewhat plasticky feel, monochromatic design, and its lack of refinement when compared to the competition. But again, all of its competitor cars from overseas were considerably more expensive, which meant that if you wanted an affordably priced personal luxury coupe that had a sporty edge to it, the Turbo Thunderbird was probably your best overall option, especially if you wanted to row your own gears. From 1983 to its eventual end in 1988, Ford sold just about 128,000 Turbo Thunderbird coupes, with around 60,000 of them being the more desirable 1987 and 1988 cars. Fast forward to today, and these Turbo Thunderbirds represent a great entry-level platform for getting into the classic collector car hobby. They are relatively affordable, and minus a few niche parts, the Fox chassis parts are a dime a dozen. So these cars overall are pretty easy to run, maintain, and enjoy. But if this era of car is on your radar, then you might also be interested in the Lincoln Mark 7, because it's the same generation and, in my opinion, looks a bit better. So let me know in the comments down below which of the two you prefer, because if it was my money, I would probably get the Mark 7 over the Turbo Thunderbird. But as always, thank you all for watching another video. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps me out. But otherwise, until next time, enthusiasts,